question of the hour. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog. Thank you for joining this live stream on heroical love, AMOR, HEREOS, or melancholic love sickness. Hopefully, all of this is audible. Please do let me know in the chat or the comments section, chat, whatever the hell you call it, whether or not you can hear me, and I will get started. While I'm waiting for someone to let me know one way or the other, I do want to thank you all for joining. I do appreciate it. This hopefully will be interesting to many of you, and it is it's information you're not really going to find anywhere else. So I guess the best way to get this thing rolling, again, thank you all. Be aware that until we get to question and answer, I will not be doing much in terms of looking at the comments, because I have a whole bunch of stuff that I have to keep track of as I speak, because I've got different elements of this whole thing. So I will get to the chat in a bit. Thank you all for joining, and hello to all. So this discussion will be about a particular type of melancholy. Perhaps one of these days I'll be able to speak with Tim in a discussion about melancholy, because he's done a rather thorough exploration of this idea of melancholy, this Renaissance and earlier notion going back to the four humors and all the rest, and many of the things associated with it, both positive and negative. This evening, I'm going to be looking at a particular type of melancholy, a subset of melancholy, which has to do with a kind of love sickness. I can't really get into exactly what I mean by that until I sort of open up the whole box. And I'm going to do that in just a moment. So hang tight. Before we start, please do follow this channel Semiagog here on YouTube, as well as on BitChute. Additionally, there's Minds, there's Gab, there's Twitter, there's a Discord server. So please do consider following the channel through those various channels. Yes. So, yeah, and those who are supporting the channel, I do want to thank, as always. You guys are the best. If anyone else does want to support the channel, you can do so through Subscribestar or GoFundMe. So, without further ado, we're going to be talking about love sickness, a thing that has in the past been called heroical love, that has been called AMOR, HEREOS, and a number of other things, erotomania. There's quite a bit going on here. I do want to distinguish, however, at this point between the idea of profane love and sacred love. And hopefully, in order to do that, I can share my screen with you very quickly in order to plug an image in. Hopefully, I am not a total retard, and I will be able to manage this. Okay. I think that this is what I need to do. Okay, you guys should be seeing a gray screen that is just my desktop, so that I can share these images with you. Okay, sacred love is what we see here with this image of the Graces by Raphael, which hopefully all of you can check out. And there are three Graces. Each one of them has a name. At this point, I really just want to tap this very lightly. If you want to know more about the Graces and the symbolism of them, there is excellent material in Edgar Wynn's Pagan Mysteries of the Renaissance, in which he sort of breaks down the significance of the images represented here. And there's quite a bit going on. All I want to point out here is that you have three Graces, and these are the necessary elements for a true or even a divine love to be present, or for the love you think you enjoy to be real. Now, there are three, which has the idea that there is a third, there is a mediator, and it has the idea that there is a love that encompasses both of the people who feel it for each other, as well as the idea of the threes in terms of how the two people who love each other have an issue, which is, you know, presumably the child. Otherwise, the only other thing to mention is that the Graces, and this is taken from Edgar Wynn's discussion, which I just mentioned, it's the idea that there are three phases to love that is true or divine, which include the emanation of that love, its emanatio, right? Then its reception or its acceptance, which is the second phase, and the third phase, which is its return. And so this is sacred love. I've just been able to present the tiniest inadequate thumbnail sketch, but it should be sufficient to distinguish it from the aspects of love, for the most part, that will be under consideration this evening. And that is a kind of profane love. Profane love is represented in a lovely fashion here with this image from Bronzino. Now, Bronzino was an artist who was patronized by Cosimo de' Medici, and he was active in the 16th century, the 1500s. And I'm sorry, 15th and 16th century, 14 and 1500s, if I'm not mistaken. If you take a look at this image here, I'm going to try to summarize it fairly quickly. We've got this tableau, this scene, and I guess the easiest way to start would be at the top. And you've got this figure with wings and an hourglass, which we can be fairly certain represents time. And time is sweeping back this blue or purple or cerulean cloth, which seems like a night sky or an evening sky. And it looks like it's time, the figure of time is pushing this curtain that might have fallen over the whole thing back against this figure in the corner. Now, this figure in the top left corner has been interpreted as being Oblivion, and also as Nyx, the goddess of night, with the idea being that much of what takes place with profane love happens under cover of darkness. Now we look at the rest of this image. In the centerpiece is Venus herself holding the golden apple that has been responsible for so much trouble. You know, think about the judgment of Paris, Helen of Troy, arguments between the goddesses about which one is most beautiful. You know, the apple marked K for Callisti, to the prettiest one, the idea of Eris or discord. And she's embraced by her own offspring, who himself appears to be on the threshold of being stung with his own dart. And that is Cupid or Eros. And so you see this incestuous embrace. And what's important here is that you really just have one figure, and that is Venus in the center. The rest are all phantasms, products of, or the fruits, if you will, of the influence of Eros upon the souls or minds of men and women. This is not a true or divine love that is represented by these three figures, which gives a kind of stability. You know, the first stability you get is with 3 dimensions, or a tripod with 3 legs. This is very much sort of the hall of mirrors. And so this incestuous, self-referential kind of love has these various figures. You have one, this putti or cherub who's running up to fling flower petals. It's been interpreted as pleasure. We've got the masks on the lower right, which represent the different faces worn by people. These are masks, persona, literally, persona, personae. It means mask or masks. And so these are the masks used by lovers, or the masks behind which we hide parts of ourselves from ourselves, depending on how you wish to take it. And we've got other figures here, one in the background that has been interpreted, the one on the left, tearing at its own hair and screeching. This has been variously interpreted as syphilis, which I think is a bit too facile. I do believe it's jealousy and rage. And the syphilitic aspect with the late stages and the madness that can be associated with that is probably something that's in there as well. I just don't think it's purely a figure of syphilis, so to speak. That's much too simplistic. It's all the rage and the dislocation and the horror that can accompany being lost in this hall of mirrors. And reflecting the idea of the masks positioned on the left of the figure of Venus, hidden for the most part behind the cherub coming forward, is a figure that has been described as fraud and deceit. This is, of course, an innocent young girl's face until you begin to wonder why her or its body is hidden behind the image of pleasure. And then you notice there's a weird serpentine tail and a clawed foot of some kind of a horrible beast. And the two hands are mismatched. They're wrong. They're reversed in their positioning. Dexter and sinister have been inverted, and the right appears as the left appears as right, hence the interpretation of it being fraud or deceit. And so this is profane love, if you will. Now I'm going to try to get out of this screen sharing arrangement, if you will bear with me. And with any luck, I am now visible to you again. So I'm going to have to start with some material from a book that I highly recommend. It is called Eros and Magic in the Renaissance by Ioan Culianu, a Romanian scholar who was just very, very intelligent, very skilled, very educated, very erudite, and very perceptive. Sadly, now he's very dead because he had his head blown off by, probably by an assassin sent by the Securitate from Romania, because they didn't much care for what he was saying about what they were doing in his former country of Romania. Anyway, this book is well worth your attention. I've recommended it to a few people, and hopefully they'll all one day get around to reading it. So I'm going to pull a little passage here from what's called the History of Fantasy. It's a chapter here in Culianu's book. And I'm just going to have to kind of jump in, into a moving stream here. So bear with me. The idea is, though, medieval and Renaissance ideas and even older ideas about the nature of pathological love, of a kind of love sickness that is specifically related to images and imagery, and a rather complex notion of an imaginal realm, Stoic concepts related to pneuma, all kinds of things that we'll get to as we go through this. So just jumping right in, that eros can take pathological forms is not new in the history of medicine. An allusion to the cogitatio immoderata aroused by a female image even appears in the very conventional treatise on love by Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century Puritan who had the misfortune to be mistaken for a Qatari. Capellanus writes, when a man sees a woman deserving of erotic attentions, he at once begins to desire her with his whole heart. Then the more he thinks of it, the more he feels himself imbued with love, until he reconstructs her in her entirety in fantasy. Then he begins to think of her figure. He perceives her limbs, imagines them in action, and explores, the original term being rimari in Latin, literally splits. So he splits the private parts of her body. The feminine phantasm, now we're going back to Culianu speaking, the feminine phantasm can then take entire possession of the pneumatic system of the lover, producing, unless desire finds its natural outlet, somatic disturbances of a quite vexing sort, called ushk. This syndrome of love is described by Avicenna, whose Liber Canonis was the manual of medicine in use in the early Christian Middle Ages. But previously, Constantine the African had spoken of it in his translation of the Liber Regius of Ali ibn Abbas al-Majusi, called Hali Abbas. After Constantine, the semiology of the pathological eros is described by Arnaldus of Villanova and by Vincent of Beauvais, who classify it among the varieties of melancholia. The name of the syndrome is AMOR HEREOS, or Latinized heroikos, as its etymology is still in doubt. It might be derived from the Greek eros, corrupted heros, meaning love, or directly from heros. For heroes represented, this being a Latin term, heroes represented, according to ancient tradition, evil aerial influences similar to devils. We'll leave that bit for the moment. That's another winding byway we don't have to get into. The relationship between melancholia nigra, black melancholy, And AMOR HEREOS is explainable by virtue of the fact that abnormal erotic phenomena were associated ever since Aristotle with the melancholic syndrome. According to that tradition, Saint Hildegard of Bingen attributes to melancholics unlimited sexual capacities. This, according to Hildegard of Bingen. Melancholics have big bones that contain little marrow, like vipers. They are excessively libidinous and, like donkeys, overdo it with women. If they desisted from this depravity, madness would result. Their love is hateful, twisted, and death-carrying, like the love of voracious wolves. They have intercourse with women, but they hate them. Culiano now turns to Marsilio Ficino, writing, Ficino himself admits the relationship between melancholy and erotic pathology, and Melanchthon makes them one and the same thing in his turn of phrase, melancholia illa heroica. The most complete etiology of the illness is found in the section De Amore qui Hereos dicitur, in the Lilium Medicinale of Dr. Bernard of Gordon, professor at Montpellier, who lived from the 13th into the early part of the 14th century. And this good medieval doctor writes, the illness called HEREOS is melancholy anguish caused by love for a woman. Now, all this business about love for a woman, they're writing towards men. Obviously, this applies to females looking towards men as well. So the illness called HEREOS is melancholy anguish caused by love for a woman. The cause of this affliction lies in the corruption of the faculty to evaluate, due to a figure and a face that have made a very strong impression. When a man is in love with a woman, he thinks exaggeratedly of her figure, her face, her behavior, believing her to be the most beautiful, the most worthy of respect, the most extraordinary, with the best build in body and soul that there can be. This is why he desires her passionately, forgetting all sense of proportion and common sense, and thinks that if he could satisfy his desire, he would be happy. To so great an extent is his judgment distorted that he constantly thinks of the woman's figure and abandons all his activities so that if someone speaks to him, he hardly hears him. And since this entails continuous contemplation, this is very fucking important. Because this entails continuous contemplation, it can be defined as melancholy anguish. It is called HEREOS because noblemen and lords of the manor, this going back to the etymology of heroes, which is one of various ones that got intertwined together. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's called HEREOS because noblemen and lords of the manor, because of plenty of pleasures and delights, often were overcome by this affliction. The semiology of the syndrome is as follows. The symptoms are lack of sleep, food, and drink. The whole body weakens, except the eyes. He also mentions emotional instability, irregular pulse, and ambulatory mania, which presumably means pacing around like a madman. The prognosis is worrisome. Quote, if they are not treated, they become maniacal and they die. Finally, the treatment should begin with gentle methods, such as persuasion, or strong ones, such as whipping, travel, the pursuit of erotic pleasures with several women, natural diversions. Ficino recommends exercise, drinking, coitus. Only, quote, if there is no other remedy, the Dr. Bernard de Gordon, professor and practitioner, advises that there be recourse to the talents of an old and horrible shrew. This is what they do when the sickness of AMOR HEREOS is so terrible that it threatens to take the life of the person suffering from it, meaning someone would be dying, pining away for his beloved, of a broken heart, of love sickness. So what Bernard de Gordon recommends is that you take an old and horrible shrew who will stage a dramatic scene. Under her clothes, again, this medieval doctor is recommending this, the old woman should wear a rag soaked in menstrual blood. In full view of the patient, she should first utter the worst invectives regarding the woman he loves, and if that proves useless, she should remove the rag from her bosom, wave it under the nose of the unhappy man, and shout in his face, your friend, she is like this, she is like this, suggesting that she is only, as the Malleus Maleficarium is to say, a bane of nature. Exhausted, the doctor draws his conclusion. If after all of that he does not change his mind, then he is not a man, but the devil incarnate. Ladies and gentlemen who are joining late, this is a discussion of a kind of illness, love sickness, AMOR, HEREOS, one that has been around since ancient times, or recognized as such, certainly since ancient times, and one that we have oddly forgotten for the most part today. And I'm discussing it because it's, I think, quite important. So I guess I can discuss that for a moment. I hold it to be important because we have the greater context of imaginal binding, and the idea that a man can become so enamored of a woman, or a woman so enamored of a man, that it would result in them pining away over the image of the female, I think has quite a bit to do with imaginal manipulation, which rolls over into propaganda, narratives presented by Hollywood and TV, all of these things. So, we can take this context of imaginal binding in general and use the insights here to better understand other forms of manipulation, hysteria, and imaginal sickness, political religions even. Also, it presumably will help us to avoid the fate of people who are overly romantic, people made sick by the misrepresentations they've been exposed to in romances, the romance movies. Leave it, set aside books and look at, romantic films that always end with the wedding scene. You never get to see what comes afterwards. And so we're all sort of addle-pated, fools in many respects when it comes to considering love. And I say that for myself, particularly with profane love, because I myself have suffered after a fashion from this sickness we'll be discussing this evening. Else, how would I have ever been interested in it in the first place? But as I said, one of the good things about discussing this is that it can help us to avoid the fate of romantics in general. You can take a look at Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. He was made mad by reading romances about knights and chivalry, and ended up winding his way across Spain, getting his teeth knocked out by peasants, tilting at windmills, all the while wearing an old, dented up shaving basin that he was convinced was a helmet. So in times of trouble, I would say it's probably a good thing to take a bit of a prophylactic physic against romanticism in order to help us guard against too much of it, a surfeit of it. It's also, I think, a very practical thing for people who have, if you will, sensitive souls. It's a good thing for them to be aware of, people who have an extreme sensitivity to color, to sound, to scent, to people's gesture and communication, to reading signs, to the secret meaning of this or that is under discussion. And I fit into that category, or at least I think I do. It's as much a gift as it is a curse. There's just no way around it. And so I think it's immensely practical to know that it is both a gift and a curse, and to understand what you might be susceptible to. Like all things, gift and curse, the virtue is the vice is the virtue. We should know that, because to be forewarned is to be forearmed. So I do have just a bit more to cover here, because you've got the idea of becoming sick because you focused on this image of the beloved that makes an imprint on the soul. But there's more to it, because we've got the connection between East and West, which I'll be going into in just a minute. As you just heard me when I was reading Kulianu, he references an Arabic word for this called ushk, or ushk, ishk, right in that range. The first vowel varies, whether it's a Turkish interpretation of it, or, the Arabic alif can be like an A or an E, depending on, anyway. We'll get to the connection between the East and the West, but it's important to understand that there is an Eastern idea of a divine love that we see in things like the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, some of the Sufi stuff, the idea of lover and beloved. This gets carried over and appears in the late medieval ages, excuse me, the late Middle Ages, in the medieval period, you have this idea of courtly love, and you have troubadours, and you have Provençal poetry, and you have the Dolce Stil Nuovo of Guido Cavalcante, and these Italian poets who then influenced Dante. And of course, Dante is moving from hell to purgatory up into the heavens, guided by his Beatrice. Well, eventually guided by Beatrice, at first by Virgil. So, and you look at King René's Book of Love, some of the illustrations, you've got the knight before he heads out, he's standing on a Turkish rug, and he's got an astragan, unborn lamb's wool cap. Like, there's a lot of crossover that probably happened with esoteric currents crisscrossing during the Crusades that make it into medieval Europe. And that kind of ties together Eastern ideas of the concept of love, including immoderate and profane love, with Western ideas, and we'll be talking about that in a minute. But what I want to get at is there's the idea that this love, this profane love, can somehow be turned to the purpose of a closer approach to divine love. So you can move from Venus and Cupid somehow to the three graces through a kind of sublimation. There's very little really that is at all original in Freud's notions of sublimation, leaving aside all the shit that he stole from Nietzsche. Even going so far as to pursue himself the woman that had caused an almost fatal love sickness in Nietzsche, Jewish intellectual, adventurer, woman named Lou Andreas Salome. The irony of the name Salome there is probably not lost on anyone. But the idea is that you can take the imaginal sickness, the immoderate contemplation of the image of the beloved, and somehow through a process of sublimation, use it as a way to inculcate a love of the divine that is not profane, that can carry you to higher and greater things. And so the notion is that some of these, let's say a Provençal troubadour would intentionally make himself sick with a focus on his beloved. And there's all kinds of examples of this in literature. We've got Romeo and Juliet, certainly, and that's a very complex imaginal explication of everything I'm talking about. The way in which they think one or the other is dead at the end and end up killing themselves. They disappear. They annihilate themselves in their desire to have a union. We've got the idea of Medea. I just finished reading the Argonautica by Apollonius Rhodius, so that's very much on my mind. And all the business of Venus getting Cupid to sting Medea so that she would help Iason. And then you get this strange business of how the bot fly, the fly that lays eggs in the skin of cattle, is a fly of the family Osterides, which goes back to the root of estrus, and a hot wind blowing in a given season that's associated with Venus that drives the cattle mad. And then in the Apollonius, in the Argonautica, you actually have a comparison. And I just read it like a month ago, and I was put all this on my mind again because so many things are connected. But the estrus, the hot winds, being in estrus, estrus being associated with the womb, womb being associated with hysteria, the botfly that lays its eggs being Oesterides, going with the east wind and dawn, and Venus and spring, ties to the sting that lays these eggs that drive you mad. And Medea gets stung by Cupid's arrow, and there in the Argonautica, they specifically reference, right when they're describing how she gets stung by Cupid's arrow, how cattle get driven mad by botflies, which makes one wonder if ancient representations of bees were really of bees, if not of and not rather of botflies. What the hell was I talking about? So the idea is that you intentionally become ill with this love sickness. Look what happened with Dido or Dido. Look what happened with Hercules. Look at Samson. Look at Solomon. We've got all these figures from literature who underwent this love sickness, and some, in theory, could at least pull out of it and sublimate it into something higher. So we got the idea that people would do this intentionally. And there's actually a reference in a medieval or early Renaissance text, somewhere around here, referring to how a woman who is so large may enter through the eyes of a man, which are so small. And they actually develop this very complex psychology of what happens during this melancholic state of fixation upon a female, or in the case of a woman, upon a male who's the object of her immoderate infatuation. The idea is that the phantasm enters as an image of light emitted as a kind of beam, as a kind of spiritus, going back to Aristotle talking about how a menstruating woman would look at a mirror and it would cause, through a beam from the eye, little droplets of menstrual blood, tiny ones, to coagulate on the surface of the looking glass. You know, things that were never confirmed by experience, but the notion is that there was a ray emitted by the eye and that it could enter through another eye. That deals with the evil eye, which we'll get to in just a bit. And I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, you're not going to find any of this stuff that I'm talking about anywhere else. You'll find it in parts, in pieces here and there. But I've paid with my life and experience to look into this. So you have the idea that a beam is emitted from the eye and it carries with it an image. And so when the eyes of two potential lovers meet, there can be a kind of transmission of an image of the beloved into the eye of the lover, which causes within that lover the image in, we'll just say, his soul to spring up of that thing he loves. So as we were just talking about, that idea how a woman who is so small, so large, may enter through the eye of a man, which is so small. And it is through this strange imaginal, this image carried by the pneuma that enters the eye and then enters the common sense, which is not common sense like you think about, like, yeah, it's common sense. It's the idea of the sense, sensus communalis, that takes the various senses from the ears, the eyes, the rest, and builds them into a integrated synesthetic image. So the idea is that you would form an image of your beloved within your mind's eye, and you would let it live there. But as we'll see, this image has a kind of vampiric aspect, frequently associated with a desiccation, a drying out, which goes with the black bile and melancholy. So what would happen with this lover who intentionally makes himself sick with the image of his beloved, when that image within him will grow and swell within his mind's eye, devouring everything else until there's one thing left within him? And I've been there, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing but the image of the thing you think you love to look upon. It creates a kind of glassy-eyed staringness in a person, in the sense that nothing else can be thought of when you're in the midst of this sickness. Well, the idea is with profane love that you would find a woman who loves you enough and in a similar and complete way that she would allow your image to enter through her eyes and to take up residence within her. And you've got a kind of coincidenta oppositorum where the male and the female switch their positions. And all these kinds of things. The man continues to be a man. I'm not talking about some trans shit. And the woman is still a woman. But as with Jungian psychology, you've got a male, and you would say that this aspect of the masculine, of the feminine within the man would be the animus. And in a female, the aspects of the masculine, I got it all fucked up. You get what I'm talking about. Within a woman, based on Jungian psychology, you have the idea of a male portion of the soul, which is called the animus. In a man, you have a female portion of the soul, which is called the anima. And there is a kind of, there's a relationship between those things. There's a certain amount of stuff that is shunted off and projected, a certain amount that becomes unconscious. At any rate, the notion is that you can change places. My image would, in theory, take up residence in the mind of the beloved. And I, in turn, would be annihilated by the image of the one whom I love. And we would become a unit in some fashion. This is the way the thinking went. And to some extent, it was used by mystics and those into spiritual traditions with the idea that they would annihilate all within themselves that was false. And within the mirror of their soul, a single image would appear, and that would be the image of the beloved, which is God, or Christos. Or you can get into stuff with William Blake and the believe it's a Moravian church, with the idea of thrusting your hand into the womb and strange sexual practices and the idea of divine love. There are all kinds of things that run off down older paths into Gnosticism that are tied to this. I'm winding into too many directions, and this eventually got to end. So I'm going to continue rather than just riffing on all of that with my notes here. So as I said, we've got East and West. And when you look into the medieval doctors and physicians who were concerned with what was called AMOR, HEREOS, erotic love, heroic love, these people were in many cases, some of the stuff came from the ancient world with the ancient Greeks, passed up through the Latin world, the Latin church, but a lot of the Greek materials disappeared or went underground for a time and reemerged in the West after having passed through a period during which they were stewarded by the Arabs, people like Averroes, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd. And so there's a lot with classical learning from the 9th, 10th century that passed through the Arab world and then ended up in the West. This is another angle in addition to the Crusades that is why we get this crossover between East and West of this love sickness and divine love. Also, it's a universal human condition, and in the Mediterranean, East or West, the classical heritage was there for both the Muslim world and the Christian one. So one of the terms that the Greek medical writers talked about, at least in late antiquity, Eros and more heroes, and some of these things, it got translated among the Arabs as ushk or ashk. And there's also heros, which I talked about coming from Latin, which got misunderstood and confused with eros, which is where we get heroic out of nowhere. So heroic means heroic, but it's really like heroes crossed with eros, and very confused because the etymological elements got all mixed up. Let's say a tangled skein. Once upon a time. So this shuk gets carried over into the Middle Ages, and some of these Eastern elements get mixed with Western ones. And it looks like a lot of these things went back to the classical world. So this ashk or ushk also has the definite article in front of it, so it can be alashk or ulishk. And then it appears in Latin where it's translated as ilisci and alishk, these kinds of things. And again, it's got all these associations with courtly love and the rest. So according to Avicenna, Ibn Sina, who was very big with medieval scholars because he had carried so much of the ancient world forward so that they could deal with it, benefit from reading it, translated out of Arabic into Latin. So it goes from Greek to Arabic, then to Latin, then in some cases into the vulgar tongues. According to Avicenna, ushk is not peculiar to mankind, but is found in all of nature. This is super important because this brings us up to Giordano Bruno and the idea of vinculum quipe vinculorum amor est. Love is indeed the chain of chains. The idea that it's kind of a Neoplatonic worldview that all is infused with a kind of love as a primary material, that prima materia, a fundamental substrate of all of existence, that all things interact within the various worlds based on types of affinity, types of love, an erotic love, one thing for another. That ranges from the sacred of the graces to the profane that we've been looking at. So according to Ibn Sina, ushk is not peculiar to mankind, but is found in all nature, in the celestial bodies, the elements, plants, minerals, and animals. It is incomprehensible, and the attempt to define it only makes it more obscure, as is the case with beauty and poetical form. One might paraphrase this understanding of the word as attraction or affinity, mysterious forces which make things strive to come together. If you will, you could think of it as what the ladies call chemistry. What comes in through your nose and through some strange kind of sorcery makes it impossible for the people affected to escape their fate, much like Medea stung by Cupid's arrow, who was dragged off into one misfortune after another, much like Abelard and Eloise, poor Abelard had his manhood cut off. Many are the vicissitudes. So we've got this idea. This comes from a text. Let me just pull this up so I can reference it. It's one of the texts footnoted by Culianu in his book, and I obtained it for myself and read it. It dates, I think, from the 20s. Let me just give you the title. Come now. It's called The Lover's Malady of HEREOS. And it was written by John Livingston Lowes, and it was published in Modern Philology in 1914. And there is reference there from a scholar who was helping the author to track down the Arabic etymology. And this back in 1914 is what they knew. The specialist in Arabic who wrote back to our scholar said, as to al-ushk, it is derived from al-ashaka, which is a plant that twists itself around the roots of trees that grow near it, and that are hardly able to free themselves of it excepting through death. Some say that al-ashaka is a certain yellow plant, changed in its leaves, and that an ardent lover is named ashik on account of his yellow color and the change in his state. I'm sorry, that was a medieval Arab writer, I think, who wrote that. Now the Arabic scholar had cited that and responded to our author with the native etymologists give various explanations how the passionate lover comes to be called Ushuk. One says he is so called because he withers away, literally loses his moisture, dries up. Again, that goes with melancholy and black bile. We have the ancient idea of phlegmatic, sanguine, bilious, and melancholy, the four humors that you see with like Hippocrates and Galen. If you don't know what that is, you'll have to look it up. But the idea is that melancholy dries you out. And this is going to be very important as we go forward to looking at other things like vines and the evil eye. So one says he is so called because he withers away, literally loses his moisture, dries up from the violence of desire. Others connect the use in one way or another with agaka, the name of a plant which is first green, then shrivels and turns yellow. So Aizajiji Doraid, after defining the name of the plant, says it is thought that this is the such and such, which is so called because of his withering away. Some of the authors assert that the plant that gives us the word ashk or ushk is ivy, but it is clear that whatever the species, it is a vine that clings to a tree, climbing it and smothering it. The verb ashka with a preposition means to cleave or to stick to a person or thing. So just to bring everybody back to where we are so you understand what we're tracking down, we've got this idea of love sickness. We've got the idea of how it involves the transmission of images and a way in which an image can enter the mirror of the mind and soul and be so potent that it absorbs all of the attention of the lovesick person to the exclusion of everything else going on around them in life, to the point that they can even die from it, as we saw in all these classic examples like Dido and the rest, Romeo and Juliet. So in the Western world, we've got the idea of eros, and then that gets confused with Latin heros, which gives us the idea of heroes and heroic sort of crossed with eros, which is a confusion that becomes a part of this story. But then we have this Arabic element, ushk or ashk, which is the idea of it being a winding vine or plant. So within the traditions of the East, which includes Turkey and Anatolia, and these are the inheritors of the Eastern Roman Empire, so it's not entirely the Arabic world at all. I mean, as a matter of fact, in the Arabian Peninsula, as best I can tell, they don't even have ivy. So this is something that became part of the Arab and Persian culture, or at least a part of the Arab culture much later. Several hundred years after the period of the founding of Islam. But we have this idea of ashk or ushk, which is something that they use in that sphere to refer to the same sickness. And here it's the image of a vine that climbs the thing and smothers it, that twines around it. So then I'm like, wow, I could probably take a look at my Turkish dictionary, because ushk or ashk is it's ultimately an Arabic term, and so much Arabic and Persian got pulled into Turkish that I must know about it. And then I'm thinking to myself, because I was originally looking at other spellings that made it look like it's ishq. And then I realized that this woman that I was deeply in love with in Turkey, it's customary in Turkish, in the Turkish language and in Turkey, when you're very much in love with someone, you refer to them as aşk, but you put the ending on it of Turkish, which makes it mine. It's possessive. So you say aşkım. And then I'm like, holy shit, all this time I had known about this medieval theory, but I'd never looked deeply into the footnotes. And yet at that time, when I fell most ill with this sickness, I was in the midst of it. Irony, utter irony, using the exact same word indicated by the old physicians from centuries ago for the very condition I found myself suffering. The woman whose image entered the mirror of my mind was one that I called aşkım, my inordinate passion, if you will. And she in turn called me the same thing. So if I look here at this Turkish dictionary, you know, we have where's my note here? I'm sorry. We've got aşk, a being or becoming passionately in love. It's just, aşk is like passionate love. Most people just think of it that way. If you ask a normal Turk today, aşk is like love, but really passionate. They don't look into the roots of the word. But you can find aşkbaz, which is as the Arabic word with a Persian ending, which is the kind of thing you see in Ottoman. And so aşkbaz makes it an agent associated with that thing. So aşkbaz means one who for a purpose assumes to be violently in love, which brings in this element of deception. And if you look in Turkish as well, you've got aşak, and leaving aside whether it originally came from Persian or Arabic. I haven't had time to look into all of these words, but you've got aşak, a twining plant, meaning ivy. Ivy again, a twining plant, as well as ashaka, a single twining plant or ivy. We also find sarma, which is commonly used to indicate something that's interwoven or wrapped or intertwined. And it looks like sarma gets combined with the word ashik to note sarmaşık, which can mean ivy, which is like wrapping ivy. And I mean, it even goes further, because there's a tradition in Turkey where a woman who wants to show that she will be a good wife will take grape leaves, again, coming from a vine, and they make yaprak sarma, which is this, you know, wrapped cold dish in grape leaves with like meat and rice. And it shows that they are fit to be a good wife. And I think it probably goes back to symbolism associated with the vine and the growing together and the winding together that yields this intertwined pair. But then you go look at English ivy. As I said, what the hell, man? I should take a look into this in terms of what kind of symbolism there is in the West. So let me just pull, this is from some website on symbolism, which has the usual sort of superficial treatment of everything. I think it dates from January 2019. And they talk about ivy, an attractive and symbolic plant. They talk about English ivy. They point out the fact that ivy, though it adheres to tree trunks, is not a parasite. Only the roots attached to the ground penetrate their substrate to absorb nutrients. The function of the aerial roots is attachment to a support, not absorption. And then you take a look and you find out that one of the things of Dionysius of Nysa, one of his symbols, was ivy, and he'll be crowned with ivy. And there's the idea of intoxication with the wine of manifestation. Remember, there's all kinds of esoteric stuff equating the physical body to the grape, and the juice within the grape being like the soul, which is freed by the crushing of the body and changes its state to become an intoxicating thing. There's all kinds of esoteric interpretation of it. You've also got the idea that ivy is the crown of poets. And if there's any category of people that is supposed to be hypersensitive to images, capable of being lost in a kind of reverie, contemplation of things, then certainly poets fit that bill, crowned as they are as poets with an ivy crown. There's also one I saw here that was interesting. If I'm not mistaken, it's Tristan and Isolde. Where is it? Yeah, so what does this person write? English ivy travels along the ground and also climbs up vertical supports such as tree trunks, fence posts, and walls. If its growth is unchecked, it can travel from one plant to another, binding the plants together. This ability sometimes has a symbolic meaning. Some versions of the medieval legend of Tristan and Isolde, or Isolt, refer to ivy's ability to bind. Tristan was a Cornish knight, and Isolde was an Irish princess. Tristan went to Ireland to claim Isolde as a bride for King Mark. During the journey back to Cornwall, Tristan and Isolde fell in love after drinking a love potion. Beyond this basic plot, there are many variations in the story. In some versions, Tristan and Isolde die and are buried in separate graves by King Mark, so that even in death they cannot be together. However, an ivy vine, or another vine or a tree, grows out of each grave towards the other one. The ivy vines meet and twine around each other, forming a connection. Even when the king cuts the vines, they regrow and reconnect. So this notion of the vine, I mean, there's even some stuff in the Old Testament about a vine that grows out of the Holy Lands, you know, and winds through time, and it gets associated with the idea of bloodlines and tradition. So it's a multivalent symbol, and it's everywhere. But this idea of the love, and in this case, the Tristan and Isolde, this is bad shit, because Tristan was supposed to bring her back as a bride for his lord, and they fell in love, and so they totally threw the whole established order upside down. It was a kind of profane love, and it was immoderate, and it represented a failure on their part in their duty. And in this case, we still see the twining tendrils of vines and ivy winding together. There's another thing here that has to do with the black bile and melancholy. That's the idea that the ivy is also dry. It doesn't transfer moisture. It doesn't, for example, bring water damage to the buildings it engulfs. It's a bit odd that way. Anyone who's removed ivy, and I've done it, I have to do it frequently with my house, knows how dry and brittle, and yet still so somehow able to cling the roots of ivy actually are. And I've seen how ivy grows up trees in my backyard. It pulled down a dead one, first killed it and then pulled it down. I was sitting in my house and I sort of heard this huge crash. I mean, it was a huge crash because this was a big dead tree, and it kindly fell away from my house, smashed a fence further down the hill. But the ivy brought it straight down, creeping, steady vines that will bring things down, slow and steady, rolling over everything. And as I said, the dryness is an important aspect. Ivy keeps the moisture off the house because it collects it, but it doesn't transmit it to the brickwork. Go pull ivy off of anything and you'll see that it's strange. It's completely dry. It's strange. The tendrils of it at times will just break because they seem so dry. And this is important because it ties to the idea of a melancholy humor, cold and dry, black bile. We see this dryness and how it can become a threat expressed elsewhere in the East and the West with the idea of the evil eye. And the evil eye is something, you know, you don't know much about in the West. If you're from Italy, you'll have heard about, you know, the strega so-and-so putting the evil eye on you. There's a story about my Italian grandfather who pissed off his mother because he married someone he wasn't supposed to or did something bad with the family. And there's a story about how he argued with his mother, and when he was walking away from the house, she came up on the upstairs balcony and put the evil eye on him. Yeah. You'll find traditions of it. There's probably some parallels in Spain, Italy, maybe something like it in Greece. But the idea with the evil eye is that it does you damage, and it often involves envy or anger. And it's the idea that a ray escapes the eye, the evil eye, and travels across space until it strikes the eye of the beholder, who suffers from this evil eye attack. And you have to dig into it quite a bit. You know, I had to look into amulets against the evil eye. And all of them are tied to protecting moisture and protecting fertility. As I said, you're not going to find this anywhere else because I've been digging fucking everywhere. In the case of Turkey, they have an amulet that they call a nazar boncu, which is a little bead, and it's blue glass usually. It can be larger or smaller. Some of them on the walls will be large, and they're made of glass that has blue and white and sometimes black and yellow. And the idea is that it looks like a blue eye. And the notion is, so they say in Turkey, that if someone's looking around with an evil eye, and according to the lore, people could cast the evil eye without even knowing it, but if someone was looking around with an evil eye, it would be captured by the glass, which absorbs light, and you would know that the evil eye had been captured, hitting that glass instead of you. It's kind of like a decoy or firing a hot flare off the back of your jet when a heat-seeking missile's after you, because the evil exiting the eye of the invidious one strikes the glass of the nazar bonjuk, the evil eye bead, and they say when it happens, it cracks, right? There are also treatments that I had to look into in Turkey that I've never seen published in any Western sources, that folk medicine, faith healer practitioners do in little villages in the Caucasus and in Anatolia, where they treat the person who's supposedly been smitten by the evil eye by laying them down on their back. And the practitioner comes up and puts a bowl up by where their head is laying down. That bowl contains water. And I've seen two versions. And one of them involves breaking an egg into the water. So you've got the idea of moisture. You've got the idea of concentric rings. It may have something to do with the appearance of the nazar bonju, the evil eye bead. There's another version that involves hot lead, where they drop hot lead into the bowl of water at the head of the reclining person who has been struck with the evil eye. And I think that probably has to do with moisture beyond water, in the sense that it steams and releases moisture into the air. Again, you're trying to fight the dryness, the black bile, the melancholy humor, like the dryness of the ivy. You'll also find the idea that the evil eye would particularly make women barren. So the idea is that it would dry you out. And in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Anatolia, it's not just the idea that a woman herself could be struck with the envious gaze of someone casting the evil eye and find herself made barren or lose her child. They also have it with their herds. So you'll see the hand of Fatima, another apotropaic protection amulet against the evil eye. You'll see the hand of Fatima or the hand of Miriam, however you want to describe it, drawn onto the sides or painted onto the sides of herd animals in order to protect them from being desiccated in this way. And there are other ways in which we find this same etymology, the idea of dryness and the idea of rays from the eye and images and all of these elements that come together in the East and West as this ancient way of understanding all of this. We have in Turkish, I heard about nazar. The term for evil eye in Turkish is nazar, which can mean a look or a glance, but it also means the evil eye. Now that's from Arabic. Now remember, we're talking about Turkish, where Persian and Arabic kind of come together. And actually in Persian too, they incorporated Arabic words. So there's all kinds of crazy stuff, like nar can mean pomegranate in one of those languages, and it can mean hellfire in another, which has all kinds of esoteric significance. But in this case, nazar means the looking at, the gazing upon, or the evil eye. But you have naz in Turkish, which means coquettishness, or playing hard to get, or coquetry, whims, the kind of games that women play. In Turkish, they have a saying, "Yere bakan yürek yakan," which means I look at the ground, but I burn up. One who looks at the ground but burns up hearts. So it's false modesty, looking at the ground, being coquettish, looking out under your brows, but seizing, taking control of the viewer by implanting your coquettish image within his mind's eye so that it absorbs all of his attention. So we've got naz from Persian, and they can even say coquettish by saying nazlı. It's even a name for women. A woman can have the name in Turkish nazlı, which means whimsical and coquettish, playing. And it has very much the idea of the eyes. Then we have nazar, but we can look down further, and there's even this idea of a nazarband. Let me find that one up. So in Persian, nazarband, that basically means eye band, with an Arabic nazar, with the Persian band, which is like our bind and bond and band. same Indo-European roots. So it can be bandage over the eyes, but nazarband also means fascination of a conjurer. And fascinans is the idea of the evil eye as well. And we've got the prisoner under a keeper's eye, who can also be a nazarband. Interesting the way in which all these etymological threads wind together with all of this. And then there's an even stranger one. If you want to go far afield to more recent times, I think the 17th century, you've got Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, also referred to as Paracelsus. And for Paracelsus, AMOR HEREOS becomes the font and origin of succubi and incubi. Again, the idea of moisture being taken from a sleeping person. It's important that this aspect of moisture is there. You've got, a woman becoming wet with arousal, a male becoming wet from a nocturnal emission that issues forth in sleep. And according to Paracelsus, you've got and that goes back to the whole idea of moisture and why it's associated with sexuality. Why the fish, for example, among the Central Asians and Turks is a symbol of fertility. Anyway, for Paracelsus, you have the idea that, what does he say? This is translation, quote, "This sperma coming from the imagination is born in amor hereos." This means a kind of love in which a man may imagine a woman, or a woman a man, to perform the connubial act with the image created in the sphere of the mind. From this act results the expulsion of an ethereal fluid, impotent to generate a child, but capable of bringing larvae into existence. Such an imagination is the mother of a luxurious, and when he says luxurious, he's not talking about anything positive. That's the name of a vice. Such an imagination is the mother of a luxurious unchastity, which, if continued, renders man impotent and woman sterile, because much of the true creative and formative power is lost by the frequent exercise of such a morbid imagination. And this is from, this quote is from Paracelsus, De Origine Morborum Invisibilium, Book 3. And so, and there's one last thing I should add. Across the periods in which this group of concepts, across the periods during which this group of concepts have been discussed, there's a central diagnostic idea, and that is the idea that the pulse begins to race, that a doctor who wants to find out if somebody is suffering from amor herois will check their pulse, and once they're reading it, they'll mention the name of the object of the person's affection. And if in fact they're suffering from this illness, there'll be a quickening of the pulse. So one afflicted of the malady, their heart will race, which is a common phrase we hear when the person who has whose image has possessed them is mentioned. And then we've got this more recent thing, which is just craziness, which I have to reference here, is because there's a book. I still haven't finished reading it yet. It's called Erotomania, a treatise discoursing of the essence, symptoms, prognostics, and cure of love melancholy. And this one was written by one Jacques Ferrand, and who was a physician, and translated, I believe, by Edmund Chilmead in the 17th century. So you have erotomania mentioned there, and it doesn't just mean sex. It specifically has to do with the idea of images that are projected or internalized that change everything through this universal love force referenced by Avicenna as this thing that underlies all affinity in nature. Again, it's a fundamentally Neoplatonic idea. It also goes back to Giordano Bruno and his idea of chaining or binding through the use of images. And that goes back to our Persian word in Turkish called nazarband, right? The bandage over the eyes, a prisoner under a keeper's eye, or the fascination of a conjurer. So there's a more recent one, however, that's referred to as erotomania, because I wanted to research this a bit more before everything got rolling. And I found that there is a contemporary version of this, which is called erotomania. And this is from Psychology Today. The title is Erotomania, When Love is a Delusion. So apparently the term survives, but it survives and aspects of all of this survive very specifically in the context of people who think that a person loves them when there's all kinds of evidence directly to the contrary. So it's more like someone who looks at a celebrity and interprets every tweet the celebrity sends out as though it's a coded message about how much that celebrity loves the person. So some of this, in what would be called intrasubjective magic or intrasubjective sorcery, is still recognized today in the literature about pathological mental states. So this author writes, again, erotomania when love is a delusion. This is by one Joe Pierre, MD, in Psychology Today. He writes, a patient of mine recently came to Los Angeles because he'd been communicating through social media with a well-known Hollywood actress who told him that she was in love with him and that they should be together. Except that wasn't really the case. Not only was the actress not in love with him, she didn't even know who he was. The quote-unquote communication he'd had online consisted of finding hidden expressions of love within her social media posts that were in reality only general comments to fans, not anything romantic or specific to him. When he was confronted with that reality, he couldn't be convinced, and at best sometimes angrily questioned why, if that was true, she'd let him on. So, he writes, in psychiatry, the delusion that an individual firmly but mistakenly believes that someone else is in love with them is called erotomania. Like my patient, the erotomaniac individual often, though not always, believes that it's a famous person who has fallen for them, despite the fact that they've had minimal or no real contact. So some of this survives in the literature today. Much of it has disappeared, frankly, because we've reinvented this whole psychology that in many ways is in no sense the equal of psychological models from the past, the kinds of things that are discussed with great erudition, great insight, and great talent by Culianu in Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. So we have a whole winding vine that stretches across time that I've referenced here. And it's the idea that images can take up a residence within us and become a sort of fixation that can have an almost vampiric effect. And all of this is very useful, as I said before, in terms of looking at things like what's going on with other forms of imaginal manipulation and binding that we see in the world around us. I believe the aspect of political religions that I'm looking into with my reading of Vogelin, will have aspects of this. All the manipulation that happens with the presentation of unreal images through the media partakes to some degree or another in precisely this thing that I'm talking about. So I think that there are a lot of areas in which all of this can be applied. But one of the most interesting for me, since I have suffered from this illness on more than one occasion, once moderately, once to such an extent that it really did almost kill me. And so I think this is something that is good for people to know about. There are many who don't have particularly sensitive souls, who are wired in a different way, in such a fashion that they don't jump and leap and squawk with pain at the barest scratch, so to speak, emotionally. But others are very intense. And even if you're not someone, in my case, I am extremely sensitive and extremely observant and extremely sort of dilated to sense impressions in many respects, but there are whole categories where it doesn't affect me. So I don't run around getting my feelings hurt left and right. And that's not what I'm talking about. That can be a part of this. But whenever it strikes to the quick, whenever it's something that you do care about, like the idea of finding a mate who is fitting, or finally being able to put your traveling gear down and find a home, all these kinds of things. Even those like myself, I like to think, who are not overly sensitive in other respects, will still have a particular area. It's like the X-Wing fighter flying into the Death Star. You get the two torpedoes that fly down a little port and you get nailed. It doesn't matter how great you think your defenses are if it comes in obliquely. And that brings to mind for me the Romance of the Rose. by William Delors, I think was his name, if I'm butchering the French as usual, and Jean de Meun. And that's about this whole lover's garden and the mixture of profane and sacred love, or at least let's say the way in which profane love can become an allegory for sacred love. And in that, as I've mentioned before, the lover gets access to the garden and the rose through a gate, a hornbeam wicket, which means just a little wattle type ironwood gate. And in the story, that gate is opened, admitting the lover to the presence of the rose by a household servant under the name of idleness. So no matter how strong your fortress, anyone can be affected by these things that I've described. And there's this whole enormous, rich history of it. I mean, I'm looking at Turkish English dictionaries. I'm looking in Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. I had considered doing some stuff out of this, but I won't be doing it tonight. The metaphysical poets, a whole group of them that touch upon many of these things. I already mentioned Guido Cavalcante and the Dolce Stil Nuovo, Dante, Petrarch, for fuck's sake, with all the darts and arrows that, you know, go flying around. The idea of Romeo and Juliet, the aspects of it that appear in Shakespeare. And yet today, you know, we got this general idea, oh, you're depressed. Oh, something happened in terms of your interaction with this other person and you're depressed. You're depressed. They don't look at the subdivisions. You know, they want to fill the DSM, whatever number it is now, with their various categories of pathological behavior and ideation. But for the most part, this stuff from the past has been ignored. And I believe that this material from that time was more Catholic in the original Latin sense, meaning universal. It was a universal understanding of how all these aspects of our lives and our culture, spiritual or, you know, religious experiences, love and desire, both sacred and profane love, how all of these things were intertwined, much like the ivy that can grow steadily over everything, tearing down the strongest stones and dragging trees with roots that go deep down into the earth, even so to the ground. And yeah, as I said, I suffered from this illness to a considerable extent. And it is only through dint of effort and time that I've sort of mostly extricated myself from the tangled imaginal vines of the image of my desires. My friend Tim said to me once, he was like, it's very interesting to discover that your object of desire has desires of its own. So yeah, it's best to cultivate a sense of humor with all of this. Now, what I am going to do is now pull up this chat window, since no one has been able up until now to reach me with any comments that they have made. We now have something in the neighborhood of an hour left. And at this point, I would like to take questions from people. So take a look at all that I have described here and see if you have any questions. I would like to keep the questions relevant to this discussion. This time, I generally take them on a number of subjects. This evening, I'm just going to take them on this subject because I want to keep this tight-knit. Very often I do these live streams and I have to cut the second half out because it's not really related when I repost them as a live stream. So what do we have as questions from our viewers, and how can I address them? As usual, plug them in with the @ sign and semiagog. Semiagog, I like that. Nice. I don't know if that was a Freudian slip or a Viennese undergarment. Semiagog, put @ and semiagog so that I can see them. I see one from Philosophicat. Hello, Miss Cat, indicating that you will try to read the book that I assign more quickly. Yes, you and others to whom I mentioned it should read it, because for all that I went off on this long winding road, this book has so much more in it than just this little piece. I didn't recommend it just as a bit to, you know, to have to do with the AMOR HEREOS aspect. This book goes into how the imaginal realm something more than the imagination, becomes a battlefield. And by controlling the images that frisk about within our minds, within view of our mind's eye, by controlling those images, they can reshape our behavior, which applies to things like Hollywood, propaganda, all the rest. It's a fascinating book. Okay, what else do we have here? Somebody asks, Marie Campari says, how long should love sickness last? A dog's legs need to be long enough to reach the ground. There's not much you can do. It's going to savage you in its teeth like a dog with a fluffy toy until it doesn't, until it's done with you or you're done with it, usually both. Okay. King Salmonfish says, would you believe inner peace is possible through love sickness, the combination of melancholy and love? Well, that's the crazy part, man, which is that thing that I didn't fully go into yet because it remains to be seen whether it's all a lie. That's why I mentioned Don Quixote, you know, and being made mad by reading romance novels about chivalry and then tilting at windmills. People don't know that the author, Cervantes, fought at the Battle of Lepanto against the Turks. And in close combat with these ships in the 1500s smashing into each other on the high seas of the Mediterranean, he had his like arm crippled and smashed to pieces. He was a warrior who acquitted himself well in battle. And so this guy would come home and write this whole Don Quixote book, The Man of La Mancha, whatever, and mock the entire idea of buying into romance and all the rest for its foolishness, for its emptiness. You know, you have the idea of these lovers who intentionally make themselves sick in order to make of it a spiritual path. And I think that there is something to that, that it can be done, but it's not quite in the way everyone thinks. Yeah, I don't know. I would not rule out the possibility that love sickness could sort of redeem itself in some sort of, I don't know, apotheosis, some sort of resolution. But it has not as yet occurred to me. Semiagog, what is the best cure for love sickness? Well, there was the one that was referenced earlier, which is the idea of, you know, a man who's lounging around thinking of his woman with the image in his mind's eye and sending a withered old hag in with rags soaked in menstrual blood to thrust them in his face and say that what you love is this, what you love is this. I had a friend tell me when I was deep in it, and I was talking about beauty and all the rest. He was like, yes, black carapace with its thick black hairs does glisten so. And the stinger above it, yes, the pincers. And so I'm talking about beauty, and he's describing how beautiful the carapace of a scorpion actually is, which led me back to the image of the scorpion and the frog and my nature. But it didn't take care of it. It's not like you can ever just realize it and you're done with it. You have to get bigger than it so you contain it. That's the only advice I can give, is that there's no escaping it. There is no escaping it. There's no turning it off. There's no making it something it isn't. There is no denying it. The sole route out of it is to become bigger than the not, to become a thing that merely contains the not, rather than a thing that is itself a sad and unresolvable knot. John Ski asks, what's the cure for all these love melodies? You've got it in Hamlet, you know, when Hamlet seems to be all freaked out and melancholic, and they say they're going to have to send him abroad to travel by ship and to put him in foreign climes and get the sea air in his face. Other ones will say, you know, fuck someone different. I mean, that's the most common one. You still hear it today, and it was in the old medical manuals in the Middle Ages. Is like, you got to get them to stop focusing. You got to get them away from it. You got to put them in bed with someone else to just jolt them out of it. You know, I'm back in the saddle again. But in my experience, that doesn't work either at all, particularly if you have a scent bond. If you formed this kind of imaginal bond at the same time as a scent bond, then you're really fucked. Because I've tried it going to another lover in order to kind of overwrite it or whatever it is. It does not work at all. Once a particular scent bond is in there to that degree, at least with me in my experience, it made everyone else smell repulsive. It was strange. What else? What translation of Apollonius Rhodius did you read? Which do you recommend? That from Boren Cool. I cannot remember the translator, but it is the Loeb, green cover Loeb Classic Library one. And it's not an old one. The edition that I got is fairly recent. So it built upon the translation work of earlier translators. But if you buy the modern Argonautica by Apollonius Rhodius, green cover Greek, Loeb Classic Library, you'll have the same one that I did, which was all right. Philosophicat asks, Semiagog, do you think men are more prone to love sickness? The ancient authors and the medieval ones, even up into the Renaissance, there's this typical thing of them asserting that it is the women that more commonly suffer it. And I've given this quite a bit of thought because I'd heard all about snakes and snails and puppy dog tails and sugar and spice and everything nice. So I had this idea that, women are refined and focused on these details, and they recognize more colors with their vision, and they're more receptive to scent, and they have these different ways of approaching things. And I found many of them crass and sort of dull and impervious to it. I don't know. I suspect that the distribution of people who are inclined to suffer from this sort of affliction, if you will, I think it's probably equally distributed between men and women. But I would say that while it's likely, I think that it's probably more common in very young women, in young and very young women, and being 7 years ahead of men in many respects in terms of maturation, I think that women get over it more quickly. It's kind of like, your first case of chicken pox or something. After you get it, you can't really get it the same way again because certain illusions get dealt with. But I think men, being somehow more stupid, remain susceptible to it way late into life. At ages where it's completely undignified to imagine that they would ever fall for that kind of shit. But yeah, I think it's probably equally distributed between men and women, but that women needing to be more capable of surviving it, get it out of their system earlier. Like in high school, I'd look over and there'd be a woman with her notepad at her desk writing her boyfriend's name over and over and over again on the cover, right? They have to work through it. Whereas some men never experience it at all, but I think they remain susceptible to it much later in life than women do. So what else do we have here? Feeling Lucky Duck asks about the maypole and ivy symbolism together. I had never considered that because I remember the intertwined ribbons, and I also think back to barber's poles with bloody rags. But I don't know anything about the stories about what is wound around the maypole, what those, fillets of fabric or ribbons, might represent, what might have originally been there. I hadn't considered it. Lucas says, would DMT or other substances help? I don't know. I've never done DMT. And my experience with psychedelics of the weaker and stronger varieties, and it doesn't extend to DMT, as I said, but my experience of psychedelics has been such that I'm of the opinion that it's very dangerous when you're dealing with anything that's imaginal. I remember once when I was a teenager, and a friend of mine and we both dropped, and we went through a crazy thing of tripping with one another and talking all through the night. This is a male friend, and I'm not gay, and as best I understand it, he's not, or wasn't. So I don't think that there was that dimension to it. But in the course of the evening, talking and sort of vomiting up our internal landscapes into projected scenery and all this other shit is a very distinct feeling I had of how my imaginal content had been put forth at the same time that his head And then all that shit eventually re-internalized of mine, but it like picked up little bits and pieces of his. And I went through a phase at like 16 or 17 when I was looking into bondage gear and stuff. And it was, ugh. And I just had a distinct feeling that it wasn't originally mine, that the idea of it had somehow crossed over to me in this night when he was talking about this and that. He's like, hey, tie girls up, they love it. And I was like, huh? You know, as a teenager, you know, went through this phase and looked at it. And so I don't know what that's worth. It's totally anecdotal. That phase I'm talking about didn't last long, and it never got past sort of like a high school teenagery kind of interest in it. You know, like punk rock girls wearing collars or tight chokers with the key on them. This kind of symbolism, but it did suggest to me that anything that really kicks off imaginal content and externalizes it so that you feel you're moving through it. I don't know, maybe you can do something with it, but the rewards and risks are probably equal. Okay. Let's see here. What is my... Sorry, I'm just trying to catch up. This whole thing just dropped down to the bottom. Again, people, I'm generally catching only the comments that have an @Semiagog on them. Joanna Newell says, honestly, are you still hopeful for the great love to happen? No, not with the definite article, not with the, but A, certainly. A can happen. To assume that it couldn't, wouldn't, or shouldn't is presumptuous, because, you know, there's far more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in my philosophy. But by the same token, it also means it might not. And you just got to suck it up and drive on. Okay. Dawn Browning says, an ex-lover of mine held a candle for 24 years. He traveled from UK to Australia to present me with a copy of Love in the Time of Cholera on hearing of my divorce. Yes. Males. Bless his heart. It reminds me of a line from what you call it? I talk about it with Tim sometimes too. Cyrano de Bergerac saying, I do not make friends as dogs do, you know? And most women aren't like that. I don't want to say anything evil about them, but they seriously, they get it out of their system by, I don't know, by the time they're 20, unless something's fucked up in them, or it requires some deeper, you know, immersion in the dye vat. I've looked at it at times from females and just been like, holy shit, this is completely inexplicable to me. You know, 1 year ago, you were telling me how much you loved me and making all kinds of proclamations. And now you scrape me off your shoe. And I've had it happen many times. I'm not, you know, going to suddenly break out crying, but it did shock me. I have to say, I was like, you motherfuckers are the most pragmatic, most ready to wipe the blood off the knife and just put it back in its scabbard that I've ever seen. They will just keep the fuck on trucking. And they'll be thinking to themselves, yeah, of course, why would I be thinking of you? I left you behind quite some time ago. I made an executive decision, and now this dude is, you know, in charge, or, you know, in this relationship with me. It's a very, very strange thing. Females can be, yeah. What else do we have here? Oh, fuck. Tim Rudisil is in the house. Hello, sir. All right. Philosophicat says, purely anecdotal, but I've seen more men suffer from love sickness than women. Do you think this is because modern men have become more feminized? No, I don't, because men suffered from it greatly in the past. And we've got text after text after text of how it needs to be treated by physicians from late antiquity up through the Renaissance. And they're all addressed to men. So I don't think it's a recent thing about men becoming overly feminized. There does seem to be a number of arguments about the men who are susceptible to it being ones who have just a little too much time on their hands. You know, when you've got to keep putting food on the table in order not to die, you don't really have the time to pine away with an image of your lover, or at least that's the argument that could be made. So yeah, I don't think it's that men have become feminized. Now, Tim, and I'll leave it to him to discuss at some future point on his own, described to me in the past how he thought the phenomenon of the wet nurse might have quite a bit to do with this. because once upon a time, people of a higher class would turn their children over to wet nurses for nursing, both to avoid the trouble, and I think it also probably had something to do with the idea that they didn't want their breasts to fall. They wanted to remain as comely for as long as possible and this kind of thing. So I think there are a number of things that could probably bear on it along the lines of nursing and other things that would make a strong impression on a child at a time when that child is unable to articulate what it felt. It's not only that it couldn't tell anyone else because it doesn't have words yet, it doesn't have a way to rationalize or even articulate the feeling. So for example, being deprived of the breast, and there are all kinds of things going on with scent. For example, the position of the child's mouth on the nipple. There's the issue of fighting at the breast, and it can suffocate, so it moves to the side where the nipple fits into the side of its mouth. But in many cases, that puts the nose of the child right next to the armpit of the female, and that is a scent bond thing. And if, for example, you're a wet nurse, you're smelling that scent signature and it's not your mother's, or you're briefly with your mother and you get an imprint on that signature, and then you're in another one, you can feel like you're kept away from that thing that you must be with. It's deep shit in many respects, even when considering the dimension of just biology. And yeah, John Ski talks about artwork, writings, and songs related to love sickness. Yes, I was recently looking at the children of the planets. And in Western traditions, you have the idea that Mercury will be sculptors, and it can even have to do with musicians, certainly writers, things having to do with intellect, and there's the idea of Mercury in the ancient world as the god of gamblers and liars and heralds and thieves. Jupiter for rulership, Mars for warfare, Venus for affairs of the heart, and the rest. In the Ottoman system, I found a similar sort of arrangement of children of the planets, and under Venus, instead of showing different trades and pastimes and afflictions associated with the rulership of that planet, everything under the Ottoman system for children of the planets is a musician or a dancer. So there is very much this idea that Venus is the ruler of musicians and dancers. And it has its own way, from Pygmalion on over. All right. What else do we have here? Do we have any further questions, ladies and gentlemen? It looks like I've got 28 minutes left. Let's see. Waldo Lewdowski, Waldo, one or the other, says, have you looked at the Plain Coran fresco showing the Tree of Life as Amanita muscaria? It was 11th century Christian art. No, I have not seen it, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, even problems with ergo, however the hell you say it. Yeah, psychedelics have been around for quite some time, and Tim certainly has a number of ideas and notions of his own as a result of the development of human consciousness and exposure to fungi of a variety of kinds. And it's not simply some sort of ripoff of Terence McKenna. It is very much a Tim original. Women's is the devil. Yes, well, men have done it too. It's just that women go through it usually younger, and so they have a good bit more flexibility. Tibetan Arts Children's Channel, females are the Jews of the sex. No, certainly not. All right. Women are the jewels of the sexes. All right, what else do we have here? Ladies and gentlemen, good questions. Philosophicat, do you think there's a difference in the nature of love sickness when it's profane love versus spiritual love? I think the potential is there in what I laid out with the mystics who want to make themselves ill in that way. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, there's also something called I want to say mors osculum, but I'm doubtless fucking up the Latin and probably confusing it. But the idea is that there's a kiss of death to the sense of self that is associated with the mystical experience of being gathered up in the oneness of the divine. And I think, and that's the idea of longing for your Savior and praying for Christ, and all the monastic practices to keep the sacred or the holy in the forefront of the mind's eye over time. So I think that, yes, there is a tradition of, at least, of attempting to sublimate or repurpose lovesickness as a spiritual path. But I couldn't go further and say that you could say the outcome's different. I'd have to look into it. But definitely there are ways in which people have tried to leverage the one against the other, what I call in my virtue chivalry as a memory tradition, equilibrium, or the stirrups, to balance one impulse against another. Ola asks what my Venus and moon signs are. My moon is in Pisces and my Venus is in Leo. Mr. Ixmy says, Tim, on psychedelics for upcoming Chainsmoke, please. No, thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you. That would be even a little heavier than I could deal with. Further questions? Questions, ladies and gentlemen. Let me look back and see if there are earlier ones that I missed. Since you guys are not throwing questions out here that can keep me talking on this subject, please keep them associated with the topic under consideration. Oh my God, I'm rolling up here and finding Mr. Ixmy referring to menopause. Oh my God, I'm not sure I want to look through all of this. Let me run away back down to the bottom again. Questions, ladies and gentlemen. Semiagog, what a puss. Adherent of Lady Columbia, Semiagog, thoughts on the different strategies for men who want to be more promiscuous at a younger age and those that are set for marriage at a younger age. I don't know about the ones who are set for marriage at a younger age, so I can't describe that. I was busy trying to dive into every properly perfumed skirt that suited me at that age. The idea was that it would ultimately lead to, some perfect interaction that would, unquestionably be the basis of a wonderful marriage. That didn't eventuate. That was not how it worked. Joanna Noel asks about love versus porn. I should go look at pornography and the etymological origins. I have only considered the aspect of porn alongside all of this in terms of a kind of imaginal illness, because it is another one of these things that fills the mind's eye with particular images and circumstances and situations, which can be interpreted in a variety of ways. I've talked with Tim about this in the past. He pointed me towards stuff like the Naked Ape and the ethologists, these kinds of things, animal behavior. You can look at how you've got the idea of wanting to have sex with a female, quote unquote, doggy style versus missionary position. And in our culture, there's this idea that the missionary position is somehow more proper, and the other one is more vicious in the sense of being all about vice. And when you really look at it, doggy style is about turning the woman's weapons away from you. So there doesn't have to be consent, because the teeth that can bite, the claws that can scratch, the rest you turn away and you hold them down, right? Whereas the idea with, for example, missionary position, as they call it, is that there would have to be some degree of acceptance involved, because the woman's teeth and weapons are right there in front of you and able to get at you. So, this doesn't fit perfectly. There are all kinds of other issues that would have to be taken into consideration. But what I'm getting at is that you can read it in a certain way. A male who particularly finds doggy style, as they call it, attractive is probably dealing with some issues related to the threat that can be posed by women and how it can be dealt with. And I'm not saying it's not wired in there anyway. There are certain aspects of it that are going to hit a trigger because of posture and position and millions of years of biology. But people who really begin to fixate upon a pornographic image, I think that there's a lot that can be done in terms of unpacking it and figuring out what the dynamic is that it embodies. And in that way, you can talk about it being an imaginal illness, or at least, symptoma, something that represents the issues that are being confronted within the mind's eye, within the soul of that person. So, and you can certainly go through and take a look at porn culturally across the board and see how certain attitudes of mind, certain behaviors are being normalized by it that don't have any association with reality, that can cause real problems. You find out, wow, all the women I saw in pornography seem to like this, and all the ones I meet don't. What's going on here? Obviously, these things don't present really big intellectual problems. If you have any kind of a brain at all, you can see and distinguish. But imaginal illnesses, or the overcoming, or the parasitic nature of the imagery and how it can absorb the imagery around it in the mind's eye and leave nothing but this single object of contemplation, that's something to worry about. All right. Semigog, do you know what is the historical significance and symbolism of the vagina dentata? I think it's just the idea that if you're going to put something that important into any place where you can't see it, there's a risk involved. I mean, obviously there are many ways in which the mouth in front with, what do they call it, the velum? No. God damn it. There's a name for it. Vermilion of the lips and the coloring and the way it's associated with the sexual flush. It's like what Tim was talking about with the naked ape. There's a lot that you can look at. The fact that breasts don't help a child to nurse, which suggests that breasts appeared in order to imitate an ass, so that our dumb monkey asses would have sex with a woman face to face. The way in which breasts are pushed up and together to create something that looks like a butt crack, so that we can finally stop having sex with females, with a front to back mating style, what they call doggy style, and perhaps culturally advance it. The way a flush is added to the cheeks, that's a sexual symbolism. So there's many ways in which primary and secondary sexual characteristics, the one can be reflected through the other. And so you would think that a mouth would be associated with a vagina with a mouth. And so it's a natural step to imagine teeth as well, in all cultures, all times and places. The idea that you can be unmanned by a woman, that goes back to all kinds of hunting rituals where you weren't supposed to sleep with a woman before you went hunting, or the lady of the beasts would be jealous and you wouldn't bring back prey. All kinds of things that are intertwined. But I think the best metaphor would be to associate it with, bucking a tree trunk with the chainsaw. You want to keep an eye on the tip of your chainsaw, or bad things can happen. So I think much of it may just be the idea that if you put it in there and it disappears, it may not come out again. Much like kids who think that if they can't see the monster when they're under the blanket, the monster can't see them. I don't know. You could go much deeper, and I believe Freud looked into quite a bit of it too. But yeah, don't stick your dick in crazy. Yeah, I'm here to tell you. All right. Okay, somebody's asking questions at least. Mr. Ixme is just fucking with me. And I know she's got all kinds of good questions. Philosophicat, what are your thoughts on some of the Gnostic sects that would forego all forms of sexual relations in favor of transmuting that energy into something spiritual? Well, it's not just Gnostic sects, though there's evidence for that too. Particularly in Alexandria, you got your pessimist, what's been called pessimist and optimist Gnosticism, but you also find it in certain esoteric Taoist practices. You also find it in some of at least the symbolic tantric practices, and you get it in, what I call LA Tantra, where people are talking about karetsa and all this kind of thing. It's basically the idea of sublimation. There's quite a bit of it in the Chinese tradition about, certain fluid, and the Indian traditions about yogic stuff that involves the transmutation of the fluid and causing it to ascend and do other things. It can be tied to the notion of Kundalini. I don't doubt that there's a spiritual or non-physical aspect that's tied to a physical aspect as well. But I'm no expert on it. I am looking at Gnosticism after some of our previous discussions because I want to look at the idea of Gnostics being against giving birth to children. Pessimist Gnostics who say that, under the rule of the demiurge, manifestation in reality is a horrible thing and that nobody should want to have anything to do with it, so we shouldn't bring children into this world. And what these latest social justice warriors are doing is taking a pessimist Gnostic line. And as many of you know, I'm looking at our current political religion as being properly a religion. So I have to talk to some Jews about what their rules and traditions and culturally and the rest are as results childbearing, but I'm looking at different religions. So Muslims, you can have multiple wives, and imams are encouraged to have children. So it's like make babies on steroids. With Catholics, the priesthood isn't allowed to do it and shouldn't. But otherwise, you have one wife, but you're supposed to have as many kids as you get. You're not supposed to get rid of any of them. As they said in The Meaning of Life with Monty Python, if you're a Protestant, you can wear a Jimmy cap on your John Thomas. So then I want to look at the Jewish arrangement. I believe the rabbis have wives and can raise children. I believe it's a one wife but plenty of children arrangement. And then I want to compare it to this modern religion where you're supposed to be so far into what seems like Bogomilism or Qatarism or something that, children are never supposed to be brought into the world. That's what I've been thinking about in terms of Gnostics lately, but I'm still working on it. And there's another Philosophicat. Do you think transmutation through sexuality is better achieved through partaking in it or foregoing it? I think both could probably work, but there's only one of them that I'm going to consider as a path. Okay. King Salmonfish says, I'm serious the archetype of the wall as it relates to boundary creation and disillusion, maybe between you and another. There's something that must have been previously written by King Salmonfish that I'm not seeing because it doesn't quite strike me as a question, or I've just forgotten what he said or she said earlier. Okay. Granny Vogler says, my worldview is Gnostic. Well, I guess that depends on the type of Gnostic. Okay. Further questions? Ladies and gentlemen, we're at 11:17, and this is going to run until 11:30. I would love any further questions that fit in with our existing topic so that all of this will remain knit together in some fashion or another. Questions, ladies and gentlemen? Let me look at my notes and see if there are any other things that I wanted to mention that I didn't cover. I went through erotomania. Oh, there's a whole bunch of this that I want to look at because Burton, in The Anatomy of Melancholy, where he describes all these different issues with melancholia, has a section on what he calls heroical love. And I've been looking, and the problem is Anatomy of Melancholy, even the 1,400-page editions are abridged. And I don't want to read it online, so I'm going to have to get a good version of it printed. And it looks like I'm going to have to do it through Oxford, and it's going to be in 3 volumes, and each one of them is going to be a fucking $120. God damn, I tell you, man. The most valuable shit I have in my house, even with all the antiques and things, it's books. And nobody fucking cares about books anymore. Here I am, the last of the people paying for them. Philosophicat. Semigog, what's your take on all these young men who became lovesick over that Instagram girl, Belle Delphine? I'm not familiar with it, but all signs indicate, I mean, what could I take that as anything other than foolishness? I mean, it's all foolishness after a fashion. I mean, imagine Narcissus dying looking at his reflection in a pool. I mean, it's all stupid. But the idea that it would be an Instagram girl with some cobbled together portmanteau fake French name Yeah, I got nothing for him. Philosophic had asked a damn question. I think. Oh, the one selling bathwater. Yeah, they're just broken, sad, fucked up. Yeah, excess. They need to be warehoused somewhere, like in a prison or a morgue. They're fools. Joanna Noel. The ancient courtly love seems to assume no actual intercourse, so children would be an absolute no-no if you wish to immerse yourself in the sickness of love. You've got the tradition of platonic love, but courtly love, yes, there are traditions of it that assume no actual intercourse, and that is the tradition where it's sublimated. That goes back to the notion of how um, uh, how the impulse so strongly felt is sublimated. And that's why Abelard and Eloise were such an odd story, because they just, sort of made it mechanically impossible when they cut his junk off. But yes, there's the idea that there would be sublimation, but not all traditions are like that. There are, if you look at some of these Tibetan adepts in the Mahayana tradition, um, there are ideas of love and the embodiment of universal principles, Shiva and Shakti, this kind of thing that, yeah, I wouldn't call that exactly European courtly love, but I don't think that the idea of courtly love was quite so spotless and snow-driven, or driven snowish. There was that aspect that involved the, God damn it, sublimation, but all of it wasn't quite that way. More of these bathwater children were dumped by their girlfriends when those same girlfriends found out how obsessed they are with someone whose bathwater they bought. Ugh. Ugh. There's one of the bullies, one of the pockets in the Inferno where sinners are tucked that Dante forgot to mention, and it's where people who buy some slick skin split tails bathwater, they get tucked into them. Yeah, I don't know what to say about all of that. All right. Do we have anything further, ladies and gentlemen? We have 9 minutes left. It would seem that there should be one good, solid question left. Is there no burning question from someone who hasn't asked as yet what is on their mind? Ladies and gentlemen, surely come through for me. 8 remaining minutes. Well, no. I'll just have to pine away, sad, with my love unrequited. Our mother's wombs the tiring houses be, where we are dressed for this short comedy. Somebody said, how do you deal with loneliness? Well, you're never alone. That's how you deal with it. I mean, even when you appear to be alone, you're not alone. At a minimum, me, myself, and I are present. How do I sleep at night? I read and I try to exercise so that I've got physical, tiredness. Waldo Lewdowski says, what is the significance of nuns marrying Jesus? Well, it looks like the idea of the soul being the bride and the Christos being the celestial bridegroom is just another element of all of this. Okay. Philosophic Cat says, what are the odds you will be struck by love sickness again in the future? I don't know. That's why I wrote this whole group of poems that I'm going to be putting out there. Or it's why I titled the group of poems that I'm about to finally publish Cinders from the Crucible of Youth. No, Bloomery. Bloomery. Shame on you, Oliver. Cinders from the Bloomery of Youth, because it goes back to that dryness. There's a whole bunch. There's a whole bunch. There's lots that I feel armored against now because it's been burned away and dried off like cinders. When you're trying to separate break the ore up and, separate the slag from what is actually valuable. But I don't know. I mean, presumably there's some other stage that could be less immature and less navel gazing and more fruitful and more proper, that has to do with standing on your own 2 feet better and finding someone who cares to do that with one. So we'll see. I don't know. I certainly can't, you can't go back and do what you did again. That's Heraclitus saying you cannot step twice into the same river. Adherent of Lady of Columbia says, do you think there's truly no set method to approach love, as it depends upon the person one has affection on having different perimeters to navigate through? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to answer that. Honesty is the only universal constant that serves you well in love, because everything else is a waste of time. Philosophic said, didn't you say you're planning to seek out a lady soonish? Yes, if all goes well, I will go on a bride quest. But I don't know if I need a shrinking emotional flower or even a great beauty. I've just burned through so many fucking beauties and had so many shockingly beautiful women burn through me. I'm beginning to be suspicious of beautiful women. Like, do they ever have something more than their looks, or moon pie faces, or I don't know. It's not fair. It's my own fault. I kept thinking that I was going to find something, and beautiful was the first sign I should hunt for. And I'm thinking they should have muscles in their thighs, be able to crack walnuts with their ass. All right. What else do we have here? Does falling into a love sickness and the resultant downfall lead to an inoculation? No, but I think it leads to resistance. So I had it once pretty bad, and then I went a number of years, and then I had it really bad. But it becomes a harder needle to thread for it to happen. It becomes much more difficult to arrive at that, because you have to do a more and more crazy dance to show that everything's in alignment for it to properly happen. I think I'd say that it probably becomes more difficult for it to happen. But if it does, it can still smack the shit out of you. Mr. Ixme says, how does one orchestrate a bride or groom quest? I have no fucking idea, but I'm not going to let that stop me. I'm being told the cute lasts longer than hotness. I don't know, man. The kind of beauty that strikes me, that I'm susceptible to, it lasts. It's not really childish. Thoughts on asexuality? Heaven protect me. I'm gonna have to deal with it soon enough when I'm an old man. I'd rather not contemplate it too much before I have to. At that point, I'm really gonna deal with my love of books. All right. Philosophic cat. I read HEREOS and the Mysteries of Love. Is that the damn Evola? I need to read that, and I will soon. I will. It looks like I'm going to be able to do an interview with Forward Observer on some things related to Civil War and some other stuff. So I'm jumping into this quick thing of reading. I'm rereading parts of The Art of War, and I'm reading Unrestricted Warfare by these Chinese guys from the 90s. And I've got to read some operational stuff in terms of U.S. Army doctrine right now that relates to unrestricted warfare. What is this thing? Unified Land Operations or something. I've got a bunch I have to read before I interview with him, so I kind of had to put everything down. And I will do it, though. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I'm probably a mess because of the mixture of cultures that exist within me. I've got Greek and I've got Italian and I've got French, God help me. But I've got German and English. Yeah, so it's a mess. That's why I have two distinct types generally that attract me. And one, is more like white as ethnic, freckles, blonde, whatever, brown hair, green and blue eyes, this kind of category, pale skin. And then there's this whole other category that kind of runs to the east, and I don't know if it comes from the Greek or what, but I got hit hardest by a woman who is a mixture of Kurdish and German, which, I don't know, was redolent of some ancient Indo-European hybrid. Who knows? We are now coming up on the close of this, ladies and gentlemen. So I want to thank all of you. There is a lot more that I could have talked about with this, and a lot that bears further thinking about. There's quite a bit going on there. So do check out Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. There's other stuff, that article I cited that provided a basis for some of this. There's also the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili, The Dream of the Soul and Love, or whatever, by Francesco Colonna. Tons of stuff with the Florentine Neoplatonists, Dante that I mentioned, the Troubadours. Is a long and storied tradition of this. The main point is that, those who are suffering from love sickness should have recourse to all the rich historical sources that our country, our culture and neighboring cultures provide. There is much there that can serve as a resource for you to help you through it. For those who have undergone it, and survived, you can. For those who might be going through it, recognize that you will almost certainly come out the other side. So that is all for now. Until next time, I appreciate all of you watching, and I am